Hi y'all, welcome to Book Talks with Kiki. I'm Kiki, let's talk about books. So, I don't know about you, but I often hear about the power of books and stories to better people. Books can expand our knowledge by teaching us about history or culture or teaching us a very specific fact. And in general, reading books is just good for your health, and it's considered a socially positive hobby and something that we in general say we want people to be reading more books. I think there's some debate about whether reading books itself is what increases empathy, or if people who read books tend to already be empathetic, and then reading a specific book can help them direct that empathy towards a specific situation or perspective. I think it's probably a little bit of both. I think you probably already have to be a little bit curious and empathetic to be able to take those perspectives and experiences away, especially from a fiction book, and then apply them. But I also think that reading books about people can help us continue to practice our empathy and get better about it. And like I said, apply them to new situations or people that you haven't before. So with that in mind, in the first half of 2025, from January to June, I have read 72 books and then started but not finished, DNF'd, another 5 books to bring my total number of books read up to 77. And I thought it'd be interesting for a kind of mid-year review of my reading to go through every single book and name one thing that I've taken away from that book. Disclaimers up front. I'm not saying that these are the most important things I learned from the book. These are the most important themes or the only thing that you could take away. I'm not saying this is the only thing this book has taught me. I just wanted to go through every book, take a second, and remember what were some of the key moments or things that I still think about for this book today. Like I said, it's not the most important, it's not the only, it's not the thing that I think you should learn if you read this book. It is simply one of many things that I took away from each book I read. Some of them will probably be a bit more lighthearted than others, and not all of these are hard facts. In fact, most of them are not hard facts. Most of them are more experiences or emotions, and they're also not always things I've never heard of. They might have been things that I was taught about in school. Maybe this book reminded me of that, or maybe there's something about the power of fiction and words to give us a different perspective or a deeper understanding of a certain phenomenon that we might be aware of, but we ourselves have never experienced. For instance, if I said, this book taught me about slavery, this is not the first time I've ever heard about slavery, but there is probably something very specific about how this book approached and depicted slavery that deeply impacted me. And I'll try to give some details where I can, but also we have 77 books to get through. That's a lot of books. All right, I'm going to go a little bit rapid fire, and I encourage everyone that if you've read any of the books that I mentioned, please let me know in the comments down below what's something that you took from each of them, and also do this for yourself. Go through all of the books that you've read, and can you pinpoint, one thing that still sticks with you about that book today? It doesn't have to be a hard fact. It can be an emotion or sympathy for a certain type of person that you maybe didn't think about before. Or even if you did think about before, you just think the way this book approached this topic is noteworthy, that it's still something that buries kind of deep into you and that you think you'll just always carry. I'm going to go in chronological order for the most part about when I read these books, but I will keep all of the books I DNF'd at the end because I want to prove even books that you don't finish reading for whatever reason, if they're bad or they just were not the right book at the right time. Hopefully, if you're getting far enough in, and all of the books I DNF at least 15 to 50% of the way through. So enough meat that I can definitely say something about them. Just goes to show that you can take, anything from any book. Also, hi, editing Kiki in here really fast. I did want to say I will be putting the rating that I gave the book. However, as I was compiling this, I was like, do I really still agree with that rating? And so the first number will be the rating that I gave it originally, like right after I read the book. And then if there is a second slash, that number will be like my new rating. Or if I don't really know what I would rate it, but I kind of don't agree with the one that I originally gave it, I'll kind of try to say that. And then if there's no second number, it means I agree with the rating still, okay? So this video is going to serve two purposes. Obviously, we're going to go over about like lessons I've learned from these books and just messages I've taken back with me. And then also a little bit of a calibration of the books that I rated, because some of these things I just like don't agree with anymore. Some of them I'm moving up, and some of them, most of them probably, I'm moving down. But also don't worry too much about the star ratings. Really, they're only there to give you a sense of how much I actually liked the book, because you might not be able to tell just from whatever lesson I'm picking out. And something that I say is that every rating for a book is different. So even if I rate 2 books the same, it doesn't necessarily mean that I liked them the same or that I thought they had the same literary merit or quality. It's kind of just like a vibe. It's just a vibe I get from the book, and as you can tell, I'm constantly changing my mind about what rating I want to give a book. So again, the ratings are mainly for me, so I can get a sense of like how my opinion on a book has maybe ebbed and flowed a little bit now that I'm away from it. All right, so let's get into the video. And I'm looking down at my notes. Okay, so the first book I read this year, Bring Up the Bodies by Hilary Mantel. This book really just drove home how messy the Reformation was, how messy of a time that was, how mercurial and confusing and Scary it was. I'm Glad My Mom Died by Jeanette McCurdy, how someone who struggles with anorexia and bulimia might think and actually practice their eating disorders, and it showed me signs for things that I can look for in my own friends and family. The Mirror and the Light by Hilary Mantel, being a bit more serious with this third and final installment in Mantel's Cromwell trilogy, which is one of my favorite trilogies and just books of all time. I could say I learned about the English Catholic rebellion against Henry VIII, the Pilgrimage of Grace, or the politics and religion involved with the marriage of Henry VIII's fourth wife, Anne of Cleves. But mainly, this book reminded me so beautifully that all of these people in history were real. They loved just as strongly as we did, were intelligent and kind just as much as anyone alive today can be. They had dreams and beliefs and were not a monolith. Their politics and personal lives mattered to them. They still matter to us to this day. We're still feeling some of the impacts and consequences of decisions made back in the 1500s, if not earlier. And these two things, the personal and the political, were just as connected to them as they are today for us, if not more so. Book number 4, Ship of Magic, Robin Hobb, how people can capitalize on legal loopholes to introduce and normalize slavery, and why certain economic pressures would make otherwise quote-unquote good people kind of stomach this change. The Great State of West Florida by Kent Wascom, it demonstrated what the mythologizing of a place or a quote-unquote state can look like as it happens in real time. Book of Night, Holly Black. This book taught me that shadow magic, and by that I mean magic with your actual shadow, like the actual shadow that is attached to a human body, not like nebulous, ooh, I can send dark shadows from my fingers across the world. Shadow magic with your actual shadow is actually kind of really cool and interesting. Mad Ship by Robin Hobb. This sounds a bit cliched, but just how unacknowledged, repressed trauma are the real things that create this kind of cycle of violence that many people are trapped in. It's not the violence itself that begets more violence. If you experience violence, you are not doomed forever to pass this violence along. It's how people deny their abuse and then justify them passing it along to others that creates this cycle. Ship of Destiny by Robin Hobb. Never trust a charming, perfect leader. And if they tell you, if they say in words who they are and what they care about, believe them, listen to them, no matter how many other things they might get right or they might get lucky on. If they tell you who they are, believe them. Just because they're charming doesn't mean that they're good. True Biz by Sarah Novick. So this book just showed me different perspectives in the deaf community, particularly about hearing children of deaf parents and cochlear implants. And the one thing I can think about a lot with this book also is this idea of EYETH, EYETH, which is the deaf kind of utopia, where everything is based more on the eye and doesn't really consider ears or hearing in the way that the world is built, which I thought was really interesting. The Capital of Dreams by Heather O'Neill. So I feel like it's hard for me sometimes to really love or find a lot of mother-daughter relationships in fiction that impactful or engaging. But this book taught me that I can still find complicated mother-daughter relationships that I love and that I think are interesting. And then something else I also took from this is if you must convince other countries that your people are valid and real and worthy of saving, it means that the war began long before the first physical strike. And sometimes surviving means and can only happen when you give up the most important thing in your world. Which, I'm sorry, I know those were kind of sad things to take away from a book, but it's a sad book. When the Reckoning Comes by LaTanya McQueen. Just truly how absurd plantation, weddings, or destination vacations are. Yeah, this book really goes over that. And just also how slavery continues to haunt Black Americans way more than it actually haunts white Americans. What that says about the consequences of slavery and who still experiences them. They Were Her Property by Stephanie E. Jones Rogers. Literally so much. This book taught me so much that women exercised a lot of legal and political power over their slaves. They owned their own slaves, recognized as their own separate property even when they were married. In general, just the role of wealthy white women in the South, and that they were not passive innocents whatsoever in the institution of slavery. Despite how maybe some popular culture or other academic texts might want you to believe, they were aware, they were knowing, and they liked their power. A Dowry of Blood by S.T. Gibson. This book taught me why tension is important in stories, even when we know how it will end. My Dark Vanessa by Kate Elizabeth Russell. How being sexually assaulted and groomed can stunt your emotional growth, keeping you frozen as both too young and too mature. The worst part of who you are at that age will stay with you. And bitterness and denial and aggression can kind of become an armor to protect you from the true extent of the horror of what you experienced. But that realization and healing can still come. It's never too late. Fool's Errand by Robin Hobb. Something I took away from this is just the selfishness in refusing to accept or acknowledge death and grief, especially of someone that you love. Refusing to accept their mortality and not allowing them to approach this topic as they desire because you're too scared to think about it. Psalm for the Wild-Built, Becky Chambers. So tea monks should 100% be a real thing. I would convert to that religion. If a religion came about with tea monks, 100% I'm converting over there because that sounds wonderful, heavenly, loved it. Kala by Colin Walsh, how abuse reverberates in later generations and how silence only allows more opportunities for the abuse to continue. Sometimes it can feed on the very young that it created. If it's not clear enough, some of these things that I learned from the book, I'm trying to be vague about because I don't want to give away spoilers. So to fully appreciate the lessons that I'm talking about, you might have to read the book, but I'm also trying to tease you a little bit, see if you're interested in any of these. City of Nightbirds by Jua Kim. I guess I learned about Russian ballet schools. All right, moving on. To Shape a Dragon's Breath, Monoquill Black Goose, how colonization looks specifically in the form of, quote unquote, the white man's burden to educate native populations, how that is one part of a greater cultural genocide and colonization. Piranesi by Susanna Clark, just the power of a positive main character. How you can take a naive and innocent character and not have him be stupid and not have him be weak, and how his positivity, his kindness, his gentleness can be done well. I think today a lot of characters are super complicated, super complex, super dark anti-heroes, and those have their time and places. I like those, but this book just did something very interesting and I think hard to do, is just give you a narrator and a main character who is at his core a good, kind, innocent person. The Mysterious Case of the Alperton? The Mysterious Case of the Alperton Angels by Janice Hallett. I don't know why I can't say Alperton. Alperton. So anyway, how easy it is to frame things as mysterious and supernatural, even if you are a cynic. You know, we're all kind of susceptible in being caught up in a mob kind of mentality or a mania. Even me and characters in this book. You know, we were both started off as cynics, and then there's just a way that people can plant or give you certain information withholding certain things, and it just sounds spooky. And it's really easy to kind of fall into that trap. Also, this is more of a craft of writing thing, but how it is still possible to build strong characterization, even when everything is solely through like text messages or emails or transcripts. Like there's no actual action or prose or internal monologue of the character, but this book still builds really strong characterization, especially of its main character within the first 5 pages of the book, which was impressive to me. The Golden Fool by Robin Hobb. This book kind of showed how to take a one-note and purely villainous group that were the antagonists in, you know, the first trilogy or the first book, and how to slowly expand on their politics, culture, and the people to make them sympathetic, multi-layered, and interesting to your readers who might have a bad taste in their mouth at the start of this arc. Beloved by Toni Morrison. So I learned about Margaret Garner and the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 and how and why a mother might choose death over slavery for herself and her children. And with the climax of the story in mind, really just how powerful of a message it is about the importance of the Black community and supporting each other. I just think about that ending so much. And it's really just like so many other authors would have set up the conclusion of that story differently. And Toni Morrison strips it back, is super simple, is super direct, and the message is so clear. Icebreaker by A.L. Graziotti. This taught me about hockey and pressure and depression in sports and young men. Fool's Fate by Robin Hobb. What forgiveness and love between fathers and sons looks like. Bunny by Mona Awad. I don't like weird girl literature. That's what this book taught me. I don't like weird girl literature. Also, MFA programs seem just as nightmarish as I suspected. You Should Be So Lucky by Cat Sebastian. I learned about baseball. I didn't particularly love to learn about baseball, but I learned about baseball. Don't ask me any questions. Things I Have Withheld by Kai Miller. The specific anecdote I think I remember the most has to do with how Jamaica was once named the most homophobic place on earth by Time magazine, I think in like the 2000s. Yet, the way that identities and privileges and isms intersect, right? Intersectionality, what that means for some people like Kai Miller and how they feel more safe being a gay, Black, Caribbean man in Jamaica, the most homophobic place on earth, as opposed to than in England or in the United States or many other countries, specifically because of how his body, his Black body, comes off as a threat in those places where he doesn't come off as a threat in Jamaica. And even though it's homophobic, he knows the rules there and he has never felt more free or, you know, happily queer than in Jamaica. And really, you can't just take a title like that and assume to know everything about that culture and how all gay Jamaicans think. Act of Oblivion by Robert Harris. So I learned about the Act of Free and General Pardon, Indemnity, and Oblivion, which granted everyone a pardon for their actions during the English Civil War after the reinstatement of Charles II as king, except for those who signed the death warrant of Charles I. While this book was actually more focused on American religiosity and Puritanism than English politics, this did show the general rift between royalists and parliamentarians around this time, and it gave us a group of people on each side to kind of support and understand their perspective of the English Civil War and the fallout of it. James by Percival Everett. Again, this is more craft of not just a book, but story in general. I was really impressed with how Everett had a slave character be active while having a passive role in their society, right? As a slave, the whole point is you don't have a lot of choice. You don't have a lot of chance to exercise your own independence. And specifically in this book, sometimes James had to be subservient. They had to rely on their submissiveness to survive, to get them through a specific event, because they're dealing with a bunch of white people. And again, they have to play this kind of passive role. And I think Everett really found that balance well of acknowledging the fact that this would have been how James would have to act in certain situations, but still making him an active and fully fledged character that had choice, made choices, and moved their story along themselves with their own actions. A Place of Greater Safety by Hilary Mantel. Mainly, I came away from this book seeing a lot of similarities between today and the French Revolution, a lot of scary similarities. Also, we should have more disaster bisexual revolutionaries in our government. I think that would be fun. You know, if nothing else, it'd be fun. And don't we need some fun? Don't we deserve some fun? Also, there are definitely thruples going on right now in Congress, and no one can convince me otherwise. And lastly, once you loophole and break the law so much for your own political gain, it can no longer save you should your fortunes ever turn. And I think we could all hope one day that people's fortunes turn and the corruption that they put into the very system is their undoing. Wouldn't that be beautiful? It happened here. It happened once. It could happen again. You never know. A Land Remembered by Patrick D. Smith. In general, this taught me a lot about old Floridian history. Even though I am from Florida, I didn't know a lot of this, but I'll specifically say like the raising and the selling of cattle, specifically to Cuba, and then the Okeechobee hurricane in 1928. I learned a lot. Creation Lake by Rachel Kushner. I learned a lot about Neanderthals when I read this book, but unfortunately, I forgot a lot about this book. I forgot I even read this book until I was doing this list, and so the specific details that I learned about Neanderthals is no longer here. But there is a lot about like prehistory, pre-written history, and Neanderthals, and like the differences between Neanderthals and Homo sapiens and all of that. Like it was very interesting. I remember really liking it. Don't ask me a single question about Neanderthals themselves because I forgot. But something I do remember about this book is that even eco-radicals can succumb to gender roles, and how sad that is, you know? Mrs. Dalloway by Virginia Woolf. What mental health treatment and awareness was like following the First World War in England, which was, spoiler, not great, but I really like the way that Woolf depicts her characters, particularly Septimus, with tender respect. So I thought it was interesting how she had this care for them that was perhaps not reflected in their culture at the time. So The House in the Cerulean Sea by T.J. Klune. What I learned from this cozy, quote unquote, cozy reads of pretty much any genre are just not for me in this stage of my life. And if you are telling a cozy story, maybe don't try to sneak in bungled racism and prejudice allegories throughout it because it just doesn't work with the tone. I Who Have Never Known Men by Jacqueline Hartman. First off, don't write off every internet popular book you see because I would have missed this if I did. And then Like Life, you won't get answers to every or even any questions you may have for a story. And just like life, if the characters and other emotional arcs of the story are powerful and good enough, then the fact that you don't have answers won't matter to you. You'll just feel complete and content with what you're given and not so focused about what you never got answers to. Dragon Keeper by Robin Hobb. So this is just a general thought. I like the themes of striking out on your own to prove to yourself and to others that you can survive and thrive away from their judgment and their hate. Stag Dance by Tori Peters. Trans people have to be there for each other and love each other, even if they don't really love each other, even if they kind of hate each other, even if they get annoyed by each other, which is a very important theme of this book, just trans for trans and supporting each other. Also, I don't care if the lumberjacks in this book were like talking made up slang, and I also couldn't even pinpoint an exact like time period that this was happening, like generally the 19th century at some point. Anyway, I feel like I learned a lot about loggers. Like how much of it was accurate, I don't know, but I feel like Tori Peters really captured a tone and an atmosphere, and I walked away feeling like, wow, I know so much about loggers. Is it an accurate feeling? I don't know, but that's what I took away from it. In Cold Blood by Truman Capote, I learned about the humans that were behind a senseless and violent quadruple murder, and while it's uncomfortable to admit, even in them, there is humanity. Like I said, it kind of leaves you uncomfortable and queasy because Truman Capote, you know, to a certain extent, we can just, there's lots of things you can discuss about this book, but he does not allow you to forget that at the end of the day, these were two men. They're not monsters, they're men. He paints them in such vivid detail that you really cannot deny, even though they did something completely terrible and just mind-bogglingly stupid and unjustifiable. He refuses to let you look away from the fact that they are human people. This is what humanity looks like. It is all of this terrible violence and badness, but also this full life before this point, and dreams and hopes and desires, and yes, tenderness. And it's very, like I said, confusing and uncomfortable. Martyr by Kaveh Akbar. I just learned a lot about Martyr, specifically Bobby Sands. He was a new one that I hadn't heard about, but also it taught me about the Iran Air Flight 655, which was shot down by the US military in 1988. Dragonhaven by Robin Hobb. The thing that sticks out to me the most, and this might somewhat be colored by recent events specifically in Texas, but is the scenes of the flood in this book. Now, I don't want to give any big spoilers away, but just how terrifying and confusing the flash flood can be, and how really surviving just sometimes comes down to luck. That was always the big kind of set piece in this book that I had been thinking about a lot. And then with recent, like I said, events in Texas, I just can't stop thinking about that scene. And it's very, kind of harrowing. And I'm sorry if the lighting is changing. It is. The sun has gone away. The clouds have rolled in and is about to storm here. So we're going to keep going really fast. The Ministry of Time by Kayleen Bradley. So this taught me about Commander Graham Gore and the Franklin expedition to explore the Northwest Passage and the Arctic. I think this book was trying to teach me about immigrants and like the immigration experience, which would have been good, but I never bought the analogy between time expats and other immigrants. So alas, that's all I'm going to say there. Tender is the Flesh by Augustina Bazterrica. The extent that we can and do dehumanize people different from ourselves, how we otherize them to protect ourselves against how our actions oppress and exploit them. Boy by Nicole Galland. A lot about Francis Bacon, a lot about like the early scientific method and the extreme gender craziness that is boy players in Shakespearean London. The Buffalo Hunter by Stephen Graham Jones. I learned about the Marius Massacre, which was a real event where the US Army massacred over 200 Fijian Blackfeet Native people in 1870. Most of them were women and children who were sleeping at the time that the attack started. So The Pearl by John Steinbeck. This book taught me never reveal that you won the lottery. Also, consider throwing away your ticket before you cash it in, because good luck like that, like winning the lottery, striking big, getting rich, doesn't come without some very bad luck after it. Vicious by V.E. Schwab. I don't know. I literally wrote in my notes, I don't know. I guess there's a lot here about like chemical reactions when your body is like close to death, like adrenaline and nervous system stuff. Never trust super weirdly ambitious guys. Yeah, that's what this book taught me. Wild Dark Shore by Charlotte McNaughey. This book taught me about seed banks and why seed banks are important. Educated by Tara Westover. How and why people can still love their abusive families, even when they quote unquote escape and move far away from them. Just that thirst for love and validation still exists, and it's not as easy as it might seem to just cut them off. This just gave me, further sympathy and empathy with how complicated it can be to just throw away all of the good with the bad. People can't really do that easily. City of Dragons by Robin Hobb. This one's kind of complicated. So I think in general, like the thing I would take away from this book is just I got some sympathy for the devil in this book. So without spoiling too much, Hobb takes a character that I have hated for the last two books and is like one of the main antagonists in a way. And she gives him a POV and humbles him, and has someone do things to him that I think a lot of people were screaming should be done to him, someone should humble him, take him down a peg, do these things to him. I hate him, right? And at the end of it, I was left feeling bad for him. Like, even though he was, like I said, one of the most hated characters who had done bad things to some of my most beloved characters, finally someone was like turning power on him and was putting him in his place. And I was like, oh no, he was being put in his place for the wrong things, right? He was being put in his place because this other man just wanted to feel this powerful thrill, and he knew that he could scare him and control him and humiliate him. It wasn't like he was trying to get justice or punish him or anything for his bad behavior towards the characters we loved. So it just reminded me, like, seeing bad things happen to people is not satisfying in and of itself. It can make you feel just as bad if those bad things that are happening to them are not getting him to understand why the actions that he did were bad. He never comes to understand that, because this violence that's being done to him has nothing to do, is completely divorced from the things that we hate him for. Seeing pain and fear wielded against him and making him pathetic too, it really reminds you that no one deserves treatment like this. That's the whole point. That's why we hated him for so long, is because he was doing this to people who didn't deserve it. And then it's done to him Again, not for reasons that he would ever have deserved. The Secret History by Donna Tartt. So this book taught me that I hate chapters with academic lectures in them, but I do love dramatic irony. That's the other thing this book taught me is I love dramatic irony. Heart, love it. Also, Game of Thrones has made me way too good at suspecting twins of certain things of inappropriate closeness, I shall say. Blood of Dragons by Robin Hobb. Again, can't do spoilers, so it's kind of hard. And a lot of Robin Hobb stuff is related to like characters. She's just so rich and detailed in her character work and her studies. So a lot of the things I take away from them are just certain character archetypes and, how this can be related to the real world. So for this, I would just say that just because someone is kind and naive and swift to forgive doesn't mean that they are stupid or easy to walk over, or they can't see how people mock them and see that they're treated differently. That doesn't mean that they're stupid and that they wouldn't want to change these things about them that people take advantage of. They do understand that people are using them, and they can only take that for so long before eventually those things may convince them that they need to change, and not always for the better. It's not a quite one-to-one, but for the most part, again, no spoilers. That was like a big kind of takeaway from this book for a particular character. The Adventures of Amina Al-Sarafi by S.A. Chakravarti. It is set in like a fantastical Indian Ocean circa the 12th, 13th century. So it's heavily inspired by like medieval Middle Eastern history. And while not always like historically accurate, I just feel like I gleaned a lot of insight into Islamic mythology and how Muslim characters would kind of interact and live out their religion, especially in this kind of time frame. Again, it's not always super historically accurate to my understanding. It sometimes reads a little bit 21st century, but Amina's religion is central to her character, and the setting of the book was kind of fun and new to me because I usually end up reading books that are inspired more by Western European religions, people. I just think the inspirations and the research that the author did for this book was very good, and it gave me, like I said, insight into a setting in a time period that I wasn't familiar with. The Pretender by Joe Harkin. I learned about the real historical figure of Lambert Simonal, even if this book has to fictionalize a lot about his backstory and his life. Nonetheless, I just learned a lot about the time period from right around the time that Richard III becomes king through King Henry VII's reign, and just the politics and the wars that were going on at that time between the Yorks and the Lancasters. Sunrise on the Reaping by Susanna Collins. We are all always part of someone's propaganda, and rebellions take time. Every step that we take is one step closer to change. The Hunger Games by Susanna Collins. Some of this is like informed by the fact that I know a little bit more about President Snow's backstory, even if that backstory is not revealed in the Hunger Games. But at the end of the day, sometimes it really is as simple as a petty evil man who wants to take revenge on people. That's really it. Anyway, moving on. The Awakening by Kate Chopin. Being a mother is hard and it sucks. And everyone in the world is going to have an opinion on how you should behave and how much you should love your children and what a respectable mother is. It just gave me some sympathy and empathy for, even a privileged rich woman in this time period, just because she really had very few choices, even with all of her privileges and her wealth. The Prophets by Robert Jones Jr. The psychological impacts of institutional slavery on the people trapped in this system, the way that impacts their thought patterns and the choices that they feel like they have to make. And for the, white people, the plantation owner and his family, the way it infests their mind with like craziness. Legendborn by Tracy Deonn. So anger as a defense mechanism to dealing with grief over the loss of a parent, specifically a mother. I just think that this book does so well with depicting that. Okay, check in. We are at number 60. Okay, hang in. 17 more. We can do it. Fool's Assassin by Robin Hobb. It's hard to be a father. And despite best intentions, how you were fathered will leak into your interactions with your own children. A Penance by Eliza Clark is reminded about the complexities of girlhood social structures and how those do indeed matter. And no victim is perfect, nor is an aggressor always in every situation the bully, but understanding how a situation got here does not always mean justifying violence. Priory of the Orange Tree by Samantha Shannon. From a more writing perspective, just could appreciate how to make fantasy religions believable and how multiple religions can spring up from different interpretations of one event. Summer Fun by Jeanne Thornton. Learned a little bit about Brian Wilson from the Beach Boys because I guess he was an inspiration for a character in this book. And then again, more of a writing craft thing. I thought the way that the author dealt with and formatted dead names in literature was just very interesting. Fool's Quest by Robin Hobb. I suspected this, but this book really just confirmed to me that Shade is my favorite of Fitz's Fail Father Figures Club. So if you know, you know. Bloodmarked Tracy Deonn. Something I pulled from this book was one possible solution or way to handle former slave plantations. The Red Pony by John Steinbeck. Okay, so the weapons and wounds fathers pass down to their sons, that sons inherit these things without even knowing who they belong to and when and where they came from. Also, sometimes it's really fun to see metaphors and interpretations that you're almost positive the author never intended you to see, and just how like that space between when the book was written and when we as the readers are consuming it can just change so much of how certain metaphors or images would read to modern readers. Assassin's Fate by Robin Hobb. This is the conclusion of a 16-book fantasy series. So again, hard to say like what I take away with it without spoiling, but a child is a child. They deserve to be protected, and people who truly love that child will do their best to protect them from the very experiences that they faced when they were children and just try to change their fate because they can see where the path that they're going down is heading because they went through it, you know, and they can recognize in these children their old selves, and how protecting these children is like protecting and acknowledging that they should have been prevented from this path when they were children themselves. I hope that makes sense. I think it makes sense to the people who've read Realm of the Elderlings. The Assassination of Margaret Thatcher by Hilary Mantel. Just people had a lot of reasons to be mad at Margaret Thatcher. That's all I'm gonna say. Moving on. Braiding Sweetgrass by Robin Wall Kimmerer. Again, this one had like so much because this was more nonfiction, but reciprocity is a basic foundation of nature. Humans do not have to only harm the environment. We could both receive something from our relationship. And I'm sorry if you can hear the thunder. I'm trying to finish up this video before it starts to just storm, but the thunder is coming. All right, number 70. Their Eyes Are Watching God by Zora Neale Hurston. Life and community for poor, uneducated Black Southerners in 1920, particularly in Florida. I think that's just what this book really captures, that time and setting, you know, how the people would act and think and speak. The Alchemist by Paulo Coelho. This book taught me what racism against Romani people looks like in real life, in literature perhaps. And it also taught me that even if someone can recognize prejudice against one group of people and be working to perhaps show how this prejudice is wrong, that doesn't mean that they aren't still blind to their own prejudice against another group of people. And that can be very disappointing, but very real. Number 72 is Passing by Nella Larson. This is the last book of the books I read so far this year that I have fully finished. And this one just gave me glimpses into the kind of middle and upper class community of Black Americans, specifically in New York City during 1920s, and how they were kind of organizing and building their own communities. Now we're getting into the 5 books that I DNF'd. So Acts of King Arthur and His Noble Knights by John Steinbeck. This is a book I DNF'd in January, but I got 200 out of 300 pages into it. I learned how King Arthur was conceived. Like, I didn't know that it was that dark in the original text. Also, this book taught me that Merlin is not nearly as much of a twink in the original text as he is in some of these fan edits I see of him online, these fan cams. I had an idea of what Merlin would be like. He's not like that at all. Not in this version. Immortal Dark by Tigris Grima. So this book taught me that dark academia is very, very hit or miss for me. Mostly miss, especially when it makes no sense for the rest of the storytelling and like the world building, and is mostly just obviously used for an aesthetic reason. I wish I learned more from this book, or could remember something cool about Ethiopian culture or legend, particularly around like vampires perhaps. But unfortunately, I didn't get that far into it, 100 pages into like a 500-page book, because it wasn't for me. Let's just say that again. The dark academia was not working for me. Portrait of a Thief by Grace D. Lee. Again, this didn't teach me about the idea of museums, displaying the fruits of their colonization, but it just did reinforce the question: who decides who owns what history and artifacts? Who can request those artifacts back? What countries, what government can say, hey, these are things that our people made. These are things that our cultures had, and then your people came, colonized our country, and stole all of these artifacts, and now you get to display them and get money and prestige from doing this. What's going on here? And then When the Tides Held the Moon by Vanessa Vita Kelly. I got a sense of the prejudice against Puerto Ricans specifically in New York City in the 1910s, and I also feel like this book really painted a very vivid image of Coney Island at this time, and the amusement parks and the amusement shows at the time, and just how vibrant it was, and how it was a big, part of social life. And then finally, the last book I'm going to talk about is Oathbound by Tracy Deonn. DNF this right at the end of June, unfortunately. And this is really something that you could take away from any of the Legendborn books, but in this one, just really think Tracy Deonn expanded on the themes of systemic racism, specifically through the eyes of a young Black girl. And she reminds us that these systems and traditions are not worth keeping. They're not worth saving or even reforming. They are not worth protecting. And we do have an ability and options to stand up against them. Okay, so that is all 77 books I've read so far this year. up till June of 2025. That is one thing, sometimes multiple things, that I took away from the book. You could say I learned it, you could say it taught me, reminded me, I don't know, just something I feel like I could continue to carry about my reading experience and my memories from this book. Again, I would really invite people to, if you've read any of the books that I listed out, tell me something that you took away from the book down below, or just spend time really thinking, what are the books teaching me? Again, I think a lot of people think only nonfiction can teach you things. The vast majority of these books that I've read have been fiction. I don't have the numbers in front of me right now, but I would say maybe 5 or 6 max were nonfiction. Most of the books I read are fiction, and I still feel like I learn a lot. I feel like it just expands my worldview and just introduces perspectives that I would never be able to experience because I'm not those people. Okay, that's going to be it for this video. I'm Kiki. I've been talking about books. It's time to stop talking about books and go back to reading more.